Yes, you know, but we do, don't we? We really do. So we're all set here. I get some echoes here. Yeah, the trees. What's today?
Hey, Christopher. I'm Austin.
Oh, you know, so,
I'm Austin.
yes, yes,
We're both Austin.
yes, okay.
Oh, you want it?
Is first service out? Here. All right, we'll wait a couple minutes and we'll start.
Stories we have, Joseph, a good one, David and Goliath.
They do vision.
You know, our stories since we were a kid.
Sometimes it's still.
Yeah, we had some.
All right, let's go ahead and get started.
Yep.
We're gonna have some fun today, so, discuss. Did anybody read Genesis 38? All right. It's an interesting story. We have the Joseph story, the Joseph narrative. It starts in verse 37. And then the author stops in Genesis 38 and tells us this really weird story about Judah. I don't know if I've ever heard anybody preach or teach on Genesis 38. The only time that God is mentioned in there is when he kills somebody, swift judgment. It's not your couples retreat, it's not your couples Bible study. It does deal with sexuality, it deals with prostitution, it deals with conniving, manipulation, and it's just a weird, creepy story. So the question is, why is it there? What's its purpose? And we have Joseph, and then we have the story, and then the story picks up again in chapter 39. So let's look at Genesis 38, and let's talk about it. If you want to glance through it, that's okay. But the basics of the story is Judah, one of Joseph's brothers, leaves the family, leaves his brothers for a moment, for whatever. And he goes and visits a friend. And while he's there, he sees a certain Canaanite woman, and he ends up marrying her. And he has sex with her, and they have babies. So he has 3 sons, Er, Onan, and Shelah. Verse 6, Judah arranges a marriage for his eldest son, Er, and Tamar. There are more questions in this chapter than there are answers. And it says in verse 6, but Er, Judah's firstborn, was wicked in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord killed him. We don't have any idea what he did. Most of the time in the Bible, you at least have some acknowledgement, like because they did this, because they worshiped idols, or because they did that, they're sin. We have no reason why, God killed him. It was immediate, swift justice. And then Judah says to Onan, you go and marry Tamar, which is a custom to keep the family lineage going. I need someone to read verse 9.
Onan knew that the offspring would not be his. So when he went into his brother's wife, he wasted his seed on the ground in order not to give offspring to his brother.
Okay. We don't know why, but basically during the act, he doesn't impregnate her. God doesn't like it, he kills him. Can you imagine the discussion between Judah and the next born, the third son? Because he had apparently the third son wasn't old enough to be married yet. So he sends Tamar away to her family. And he has this discussion with his third son. Hey, son, I've got the custom is we arrange marriages. I've got the girl for you. You need to go and marry Tamar. And I picture this teenager going, Dad, I was just at a youth retreat. And I took a pledge of celibacy. I'm not getting married. I'm definitely not getting married to Tamar because everybody that goes with her ends up dying. I'm not doing it. I'm just not, So they proceed, and then okay. So Judah's wife dies, and he goes into a period of grief. He goes to his sheep herd. He said, I'll find comfort in the sheep, work, doing what I'm supposed to do. But we all know that work does not replace companionship, relationship, and all that. So he sees a woman, he goes, I'm gonna basically fill my grief with sex. So he sees this girl thinking that she's back up. So Tamar hears about this. And in the meantime, Tamar realizes that the third son of Judah was not going to be her husband. Judah had betrayed his custom or whatever. So she dresses as a prostitute. Judah goes to see his friends, the sheep. He sees this woman, goes to, hey, I like you, let's do this thing. She goes, okay, I'll let you do it, but you got to pay me. What are you going to pay me? So he gives up, he pledges like a goat. Okay, till I get there, what are you going to give me? So he gives up his signet ring, which is his authority, a cord, probably a sash, and his staff. They proceed to have sex. Because she was a prostitute, Judah said, okay, I'm done. Well, in the meantime, Tamar takes off her prostitute clothes, puts on her widow clothes, and leaves the area. Well, Judah's thinking, well, that girl's pretty nice. I'm going to go back and find her, realizing that she's not there. In fact, there was no record of a temple prostitute there. Judah goes, oh well. I've lost a few things, but oh well, let it go. A few months pass, and Tamar is pregnant, and they start accusing Tamar of being wicked. So Judah's first reaction was, kill it. At the trial, Tamar produces whoever these items are, my cord, my set, all those things, that's who the father is. Judah realizes he's caught. Tamar's child is his. And he doesn't see her again for the rest of time. Why is this story there? It's weird, it's creepy, you got all kinds of stuff going on. Why does Moses, the author of Genesis, put this story in there? Any ideas?
I think this chapter is in there because it's like there's a contrast that's going on.
Okay.
For instance, in chapter 37, when the brothers sell off Joseph to Egypt, how do they attempt to deceive Jacob?
Okay.
They take the coat of Jacob and they dip it in what? The blood of a goat. And then you have in chapter 38, you have Judah who is deceived by what? A goat.
Yeah.
Right? That's how the rabbis, when they looked at that, interpreted the work of Yahweh there. You also have Tamar, who is acting as a seductress, versus chapter 39, the next chapter, where you have Potiphar's wife,
Okay.
who is attempting to seduce Joseph, and you get a contrast with the chaste nature of Joseph with the carnal nature of Judah. And the other thing that you see here is when Joseph is informed in chapter 37 that his son is apparently dead, he goes into a grief and he can't console him. But when Judah loses two sons, there's no word of him grieving at all.
Right.
So there's a lot of things that are going on. There's another thing that you haven't got to yet. I don't know if you're going to get to, but that's Perez.
Okay. So we have, yeah, that's a good point. Contrast. One of the keys to it is, first of all, looking at, is there some aspect of redemption? And the other thing to look at, especially when you look at genealogies, because you can get bogged down in genealogies. This person begat. But at least on a surface level, one way to look at genealogy is who gets the press, who gets the ink. That tells us that that person, that lineage is important. Or, we'll talk about in a little bit, where does that genealogy end? Is it pointing to a certain person? And that's important. So, one of the sons of Tamar is Perez. Why is that important? Not terribly significant because he doesn't get necessarily a lot of ink or a lot of details, but he gets more coverage than his brother Terah. So the story continues with Joseph. Verse 39, Joseph's his slavery, his rise to power, and all that. The Judah and Tamar story, along with the various of the contrast, it doesn't make sense until you get to Genesis 45. Let's look at Genesis 45, verses 7 and 8. So we'll go ahead and read that if you got it. Genesis 45, 7 and 8.
And God sent me before you to preserve a posterity for you in the earth, and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So now it was not you who sent me here, but God. And he has made me a father to Pharaoh, the Lord of all his house, and a ruler throughout all the land of Egypt.
So this is where your notes start with three principles. First of all, Joseph had a deep understanding that it was God in control of his life. God sent him there. So again, we have a principle of one for the many. The second principle is Joseph's strong belief in the sovereignty of God. He believed that God was in control of history, God was in control of his life, and God had brought him for a purpose. And then the third principle is the one for the many. And just a quick a side note on Judah. So Judah was one of the main instigators of trying to get rid of Joseph. And then Reuben steps in and says, wait, don't kill him, you know. And Reuben was going to try to rescue Joseph. Reuben leaves, and Judah takes over, and Judah says, let's sell him. Let's build this deception. Let's do this. I think that's also another reason for 38. It says that Judah left his brothers. Perhaps that was his way of hiding, trying to cover up, trying to stay away from his father so he wouldn't reveal, what he did. So Judah was one of the main instigators to get rid of Joseph. Judah has a subtle change. In the course of time, his brothers come to Egypt. They confront Joseph, and he hides his identity from them. And eventually, Joseph says, well, bring me your youngest son so I know that you're telling the truth, your youngest brother. And Judah, in chapter 43, 8-9, tells Jacob, look, if I don't bring him back, it's on me. You can kill me, you can do whatever. It's on me. So he takes a selfless act. Then also again in 44 verses 33 and 34, before Joseph, he says, take me. Take me as your slave. Let this boy go. So there's a subtle change in Judah, a subtle redemptive aspect, if you will. And it's just, the point is, when we read the scriptures, the Old Testament, there's stuff that don't make sense. There's stuff in, like Genesis 38. Why? Like you said, there's a contrast. And there's a redemptive act, but you have to have a careful reading. If we read the Bible carefully and kind of look for some of these little details, some of these little clues, we get a hint of that God is doing something, God is redeeming. So Genesis 49, 8 through 12, this is an important concept in the Bible. Someone read 49:10. Genesis 49:10.
The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff between his feet, until tribute comes to him, and to him shall be the obedience of the peoples.
So in Jacob's blessing to Judah, he prophesies or promises that there's going to be a ruler coming from Judah. A different kind of ruler that would require total obedience. We know from the New Testament, looking back, that ruler was most likely Christ, the Messiah. If not Christ for sure, if not Jesus, that we know, at least an individual that was going to come from Judah that was going to be this ruler, a different type of ruler. So we have this messianic line going through. When Joseph tells his brothers, I was sent here to preserve life, whose life did he preserve? Immediately. His brothers, basically the nucleus of Israel. Who was part of that salvation deliverance? Judah. Who else did it include? Our boy Perez. Why? The messianic line is protected, is preserved. Which, if you think about it carefully, that's also mind-boggling. If God knew he was going to have a Messiah, going to have this person, his son, incarnate, why does God need people and us to protect that line? You know, it's just, and we see that throughout Genesis, throughout the Old Testament, various scenes where people intervene in order to preserve the line. Another example would be Esther. What she does in captivity as the queen preserves the Israelite nation, at least so they aren't annihilated. Why? Can't God protect his own people? Why does he need people to keep his line going? I don't really have an answer for that. It's one of those questions of, God, why? Why do you need Joseph to protect the line? You know, wouldn't you be able to raise up a Messiah even if the family of Israel was wiped out by the flood or the famine?
It seems to me that through the Old Testament, there's two things that are consistent. One is the protection of the seed to produce the Messiah. And that is a series of victories, of battles and victories that occur all throughout the Old Testament. The other thing that is consistent is the persistent evilness or wickedness of man that causes the persistent confrontations and victories that God has in mind, that God did to produce the Messiah. So two things are persistent: the continual evilness of man and the continual victories of God.
Right, exactly. So God is going somewhere. I don't think we're going to have time, so we can do other things. 1 Chronicles 2, 3 through 15. It gives again, a summary. 1 Chronicles 2, let's just look at it briefly. 1 Chronicles 2 gives a genealogy. And sometimes when you look at some of these key people, suddenly the genealogies aren't quite as boring. It still takes some work to get through them, like who's this and do they play important parts. And you know, there's a lot of names mentioned and they're never mentioned again, so it's kind of difficult. 1 Chronicles chapter 2. And we see another genealogy. Verse 4. And Tamar from Judah bore Perez. There's our boy Perez again. And he goes through all these different people, and he gets to David. The goal of this genealogy is to get to David. To point the fact that God is working through all these people to get to David. Verse 15 is the getting to David. Luke traces a similar a lineage, but he does it in reverse. So let's look at Luke 3. I'm just going to go briefly. I'm going to talk about these other two passages. Starts in, well, verse 23 gives a genealogy starting with Jesus. It goes down through. And then verse 30, the son of Judah, or Jonah, the son of David, Obed, Boaz, Perez. Again, Perez gets some recognition as being part of Jesus' lineage, so he gets some recognition. And then verse 38, the son of Enosh, the son of Seth, son of Adam, the son of God. What Luke is trying to prove is that Jesus is the Son of God, that Jesus is the incarnate Son of God, and he uses genealogy to make his point. All right, let's quickly look at some of these characters, some prominent characters that Luke mentions. We talked about this before, but Seth, Genesis 4:24, for God has appointed another seed. So between 3 and 4, there was already a connection of God's got to do something. God's got to bring this seed, this person, and Eve acknowledges that Seth could be this other seed. They were thinking immediate things. Then Enosh, 4:26, then men began to call upon the Lord. So there was obviously a time between Genesis 3 and 4 of men, people began to move away, drift away from God. So Enosh brings that back around. Genesis 5:24 is interesting. Enoch. What is Enoch known for? Walk with God. What else is he noted for? He didn't die. If you read Genesis 5:4-5, after every person's mentioned, it says that he died, and he died, and he died. You get to Enoch, and it changes. So now suddenly, someone can walk with God and not die. It gives us a clue that God is going to do something. God has not forgotten his promises. He's going to move on. He's going to do something new. He's going to do something good. And it's symbolized in Enoch, walking with God, not dying. So death was an important part. Enoch changes that. And then Genesis 9:26, bless the Lord God of Shem. So after Noah gets out of the ark, God's beginning to do another work, a recreation, if you will. All that to say that the Messianic line is messy. It's full of sinners. It's full of people that don't make sense. But the point is, Jesus Christ came to save sinners. And even the most messiest of sins, God came to redeem. God came to redeem Judah. God came to redeem Perez, Tamar. All these people listed, the Messianic line is messy, but God came to save sinners. So he knows what to do. All right, let's look at Ruth real briefly. What's the story of Ruth? Everyone knows the story of Ruth. What's Ruth about? Okay, in your notes, one of the first things is, what's the most common theme when you hear people talk about Ruth? What's the most common theme that they talk about?
That he was the son of David.
What's that?
That he was an ancestor of David's.
Ancestor of David, that's the important part. But typically, what do people, when they talk about Ruth, what's the one subject they talk about?
Redemption.
Redemption, the kinsman redeemer. That gets a lot of sermons, who's the kinsman redeemer, how is it related, how does it point to Christ? Very important thing. But what if Ruth is something more? What if Ruth is something less? How could it be less than that? And that could be important. The context of Ruth, like Gary said, it's a contrast. It appears, it takes place during the time of the judges. We don't know exactly when, that time frame, but it takes place during the time of Judges. And Judges is summarized in Judges 21:25. In those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. It was chaos. Very similar to our own generation, where everything is relative and everybody can do what they want to do, no consequences, and it created chaos. And whenever you have that kind of government, that kind of system, it breaks down real quick. There was a famine in the land. And then we're not going to get into the contrast of it, but Bethlehem means house of bread. There's a famine. So there's that connection too of why would God allow a famine? Why would God house of bread? But then you have, if you know the story, Naomi comes from Bethlehem. She leaves to go to another area because of the famine, which was a very common practice back then. You go where the food was. She settles there, marries, has a couple sons. They get married. All three of the men die. Naomi is left distraught, broken, hurting. She goes back to Bethlehem as a broken woman. She tries to convince her daughter-in-laws, don't go with me. Basically, I'm a broken woman. I'm going back to my hometown to die, live my days in peace. Go. I can't help you. One of them doesn't go. We know the story of Ruth. Ruth stays with her. What's interesting in Ruth, if you read it carefully, and that is Ruth 1:16 and 17. No. Ruth 1:19. So take the place is Bethlehem, a small village near Jerusalem. Again, the house of David. Someone read 1:19.
So the two of them went on until they came to Bethlehem. And when they came to Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. And the women said, "Is this Naomi?"
They were excited. They were welcoming. Naomi expected to come back a broken woman because in that time frame, being married was important. She thought she was going to go back humbled, hurting. The town welcomes her. It's like, wait, is this Naomi? Great, you're back. And they also welcome Ruth, an outsider. They were showing kindness to the hurting, to the broken. They were showing kindness to an outsider. One of the principles of Ruth, well, we talk about then the descendants. That's the other key thing of Ruth and Boaz. Let's look at chapter 4, 14, 17, and 18. Someone read 14, 4:14.
Then the woman said to Naomi, "Blessed be the Lord, who has not left you this day without a close relative, and may his name be famous in Israel."
And then someone read 17.
And the woman of the neighborhood gave him a name, saying, "A son has been born to Naomi," and they named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David.
And then it's interesting, verse 18, they bring up, now this is the genealogy of Perez. There's our boy Perez again. Perez just keeps showing up. And in the final verse, Obed begot Jesse, Jesse begot David. So the third principle is the lineage of Ruth and Boaz. Two purposes of Ruth, other than the kinsman redeemer. One, it showed how it was possible for a community to follow God's ways, to do loving kindness. They treated the widows good. They followed the customs. They allowed the poor, the widows, to glean the fields. Boaz follows the town customs of going through the elders. They met at the gates, the town, to discuss important matters, discuss things. He followed the procedures. He followed the laws, the customs. They were doing the best they could to follow the ways of God. Ruth is a good example of what it means for a group of people, a community of people, to live according to God's standards in the midst of judges that says everyone did what was right in their own eyes. this community in Bethlehem did not do what was right in their own eyes. They did what was right in God's eyes. So that's one other aspect. And the other aspect of Ruth was to get to David. Not Samuel, the last prophet, judge, priest type of ruler. And not to Saul, the first king, but to get to David. So you have this beautiful love story, this community, just to get to David. Which brings us up to 1 Samuel 17. David and Goliath. When we hear the story of David and Goliath, and there's a couple songs out on the radio that aren't necessarily correct, who do we relate to? Or who do we want to relate to? David, fighting the giants, or the crowd? And it's a trick question. Because if you say David, you go, well, you're pretty egotistical because you want to be like David. If you say the crowd, you go, well, I don't want to follow the crowd because that looks kind of bad. The answer is we relate more to the crowd than to David. And you often hear, it's even used even now, David versus Goliath. The little guy versus the big guy. So I wish I had a faith of David to fight my giants. Which I guess you could make that principle, but it's probably not accurate. The David and Goliath story is really showing how God's Messiah is going to operate. The one for the many. We relate to the crowd because Messiah, a singular person, and we notice Jesus Christ, what he did on the cross, we participate in that, the one for the many. So let's look at just a couple keys to David and Goliath. David steps in to do the work of the king. One of the goals, one of the roles of the king, or of a king, was to fight our battles, to fight the battles. And we see this in 1 Samuel 8, 19 to 20. Let's look at that. 1 Samuel 8, 19 and 20.
Nevertheless, the people refused to listen to the voice of Samuel, and they said, "No, but there shall be a king over us, that we may also be like all the nations, that our king may judge us and go out before us and fight our battles."
So that was what they wanted. People wanted someone to fight for them, so they wouldn't have to do that. Saul does this to a certain degree. 1 Samuel 14:47. Someone got that?
After Saul had assumed rule over Israel, he fought against their enemies on every side, Moab, the Ammonites, Edom, the kings of Zobah, and the Philistines. Wherever he turned, he inflicted punishment on them.
We know a few things of what happened to Saul. He took some things that he wasn't supposed to do. He took the right of the priest. He spared some of the enemies. But there's something else that happened to Saul. Between chapter 14 and chapter 17, he's no longer on the battlefield. Saul's not fighting the fight. He's back away from the battlefield. What happens to Saul between 14 and 17? We know a lot of things happen, but suddenly he's fighting, doing all this fighting, and Goliath shows up, and the Philistine shows up, and he's afraid. So then David steps in to do the work of the king. 17, 45 through 47. Well, first of all, verse 26. Then David spoke to the man who stood by him, saying, what shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the approach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? David's known for having a heart for God. That was one of the things that, you can see David's heart. Anything against Israel, against God's army, was an affront, and it needs to be dealt with. And that showed his heart. Let's look at 45 through 47. Verse 45. Someone got that? Go ahead and read the whole thing. 45 through 47.
Then David said to the Philistine, you come to me with a sword, a spear, and a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have taunted. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands, and I will strike you down and remove your head from you. I will give the dead bodies of the army of the Philistines this day to the birds of the sky and the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel, and that all this assembly may know that the Lord does not deliver by sword or by spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands.
I think one of the things that David was saying is we shouldn't compromise with sin. We shouldn't compromise with the ways of the world. And in the vernacular of David, when sin enters, evil enters, we should take his stinking head off. Don't play with it. Don't discuss it. Take his head off. And that was David's response. Look, you are against God. You're against my God. You're against the armies of God. I'm taking your head off. So the episode of David points to how the true Messiah is going to operate. God was showing Israel through David that he was going to fight a different battle. The Messiah, which David typifies, would fight a different battle. In verse 46, all the earth, all the people, including the Philistines, would know Israel has a God, a living, powerful God. So it also hints at the missional purposes of God, that all people are going to understand who God of Israel is. And then verse 47, all this assembly, referred to Israel, is going to know that God, your God, is a living and powerful God. And then through David, God was also showing God would fight the battles, and it's his fight. And that's when Jesus comes, there's all kinds of issues of what he should do and shouldn't do, how he should fight. Okay, recognize you as someone special from God. Perhaps you are the Messiah. Well, then you need to destroy the Roman Empire. Or the world is so evil, you need to withdraw with us to the Assyrians, the Qumran. Let's draw away from God. Or the Pharisees might say, okay, if you are the Son of God, why are you hanging out with sinners? Why are you having dinner with these sinners? Why are you including all these outcasts that defile our pure religion? We know the story. Jesus turns everything that they thought he should do and how he should operate on its head. And that's what God is trying to point to with David. The Messiah is going to do things differently than you expect. There's going to be a singular Messiah that's going to come, and he's going to do things and defeat evil in a way that you're not going to expect. Now, of course, David points to and is often a type of Messiah, but it's not always a one-to-one correspondence. Because not everything that David did was good and righteous. He had some issues. So not everything that David did corresponds one-to-one to Christ. So you have to be careful with that. But David, at least in the David and Goliath story, points to a Messiah that's going to fight Israel's battle in a different way. Not with swords and strength. And that's one of Saul's problems. He amassed this army and drifted away from God. We don't know what could have happened if Saul would have stayed true to his calling at the beginning. But we know the story. He drifted away. David steps in to do the role of the king that Saul should have done. Okay, we don't have time to talk about it, but if you want an interesting piece of homework, Luke's Gospel. Luke's Gospel starts in Jerusalem. Everything centers around Jerusalem. You've got the temple, you've got Zechariah, you've got John's parents, you've got these elderly saints waiting for Jesus. And then in chapter 2, verses 41 through 49, you have Jesus in Jerusalem, you have Jesus at Passover, you have Jesus in the temple. One of Luke's, if you read Gospel of Luke, it's a progression of taking Jesus to Jerusalem. And in chapter 9:51, it talks about steadfastly towards Jerusalem. Luke 22, 1 through 23. These are, read these two passages. Jesus is in Jerusalem, the Passover. What's similar in those two passages? What's different? And how does Luke travel from Jesus as a boy to Jesus the victor at the end of Luke? Jerusalem to Jerusalem again. So just an interesting study, something to think about this week if you want to, just think about that. And the other thing you might want to think about and I want to do a deeper study on it, but Luke mentions a lot of dinners that he has with various people. His disciples, his enemies, sinners. He has these stories around meals and festivals. How do they go? So look up, if you want to, look up those passages in Luke and just some thoughts on how does God move Jesus to the two different Passovers in Bethlehem. All right, that's it.